I already mentioned Ben Wallace in my live stream, but I want to talk about this still, because his departure could put additional pressure on Conservative Prime Minister Sunak. Wallace would rather work in a bar or do something with horse racing, is what he said. And in hindsight, British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace's behavior at last week's NATO summit sounds like the cry of a tortured creature. Ukraine should occasionally show a little gratitude. That's what the former captain of the Scottish Guards replied harshly to President Volodymyr Zelensky's criticism of the Western alliance. After all, we are not Amazon. Unlike the US shipping giant, the West cannot do every wish and meet every wish Kiev has, and that promptly. In the meantime, he has classified his controversial comment with a tweet in Ukrainian. But on Sunday, the Conservative publicly gave up. He would leave the London cabinet at the latest in the fall, and also leave politics at the next election. Over the weekend, he posted a lengthy statement in Ukrainian on his Twitter account to frame his comments on aid to Ukraine. This made headlines last week. And he wrote, "My comments on how best to support Ukraine have attracted a great deal of interest and have been somewhat misinterpreted," is what his statement said. As someone who is very committed to mobilizing support for Ukraine, Wallace explained that he discussed the challenges of doing so. He said that sometimes Ukraine has to understand that in many countries and in some parliaments, the support is not as great as in the UK. Parliaments often have competing needs, and Ukraine and Britain must continue to encourage them to give strong support. British media quoted Wallace last week as saying that he had advised Kiev to consider asking other states to give up their own weapon stocks in favor of Ukraine, or to convince doubting politicians in the United States, for example. And he said, like it or not, people want to see some gratitude. And he told Ukrainians last year when he was given a list that Britain was not Amazon, and this caused astonishment in Kiev. And as I said, Wallace has now explained that the Amazon-related comments were made last year to emphasize that the UK's relationship with Ukraine is not transactional, but rather a partnership. And he personally will support Ukraine on its way for as long as it's necessary. But he won't be in the position for that long. But the Vilnius rencontre is one of a series of frustrations suffered by what experts have called the best defense minister of the past 2 decades and a staunch supporter of Ukraine. Last month, he published in the business magazine Economist in German we would say, what the sparrows were whistling from the rooftops in London. Wallace would have liked to succeed the Norwegian incumbent Jens Stoltenberg to the post of NATO Secretary General. But the discreet wooing of his Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was unsuccessful. The official reason given is the widespread desire for a female head of government, or at least a woman in the alliance's most important civilian office. According to rumors in London, US President Joe Biden was specifically targeting current EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. However, the ongoing skepticism about the Brexit island is also likely to play a role. Although Wallace voted to remain in the EU in 2016, he subsequently distinguished himself as one of the most important supporters of Brexit barker Boris Johnson. And thirdly, Wallace was also annoyed with Sunak on Friday. His PR people had whispered to the Times what the minister had confided in his boss 4 weeks ago. He wanted to do this at the next cabinet reshuffle, which is probably planned for September, and leave the government and not stand again in the next election. Annoyed by Downing Street's indiscretion, Wallace gave a lengthy interview to the sister paper The Sunday Times and confirmed his impending resignation. The minister loyally asserts that the government can win the next election. Well, 4 days before 3 difficult by-elections, the news of the resignation of one of the most popular Conservative politicians comes at a very inconvenient time for Prime Minister Sunak. Now, the elections are today. 4 dozens of his MPs, including other celebrities such as ex-Minister Dominic Raab and Chloe Smith, or the 29-year-old young hope Dehanna Davison, no longer want to run for the upcoming general election in autumn 2024. The reason is obvious. According to all polls, the Tories expect a crushing defeat after 14 years in office. And there is another factor in Wallace's case. Because his constituency in Northern England and Wyre is being dissolved, he should have looked elsewhere long ago. But after 4 years in the Scottish Parliament and 18 years in the House of Commons, he reports that his time in politics is coming to an end. What follows does not have to be a lucrative job in the economy. I'd also like to work in a bar or do something with horse racing, he said. I mentioned that in the beginning. And the minister reminded the nation and the West as a whole of the threats posed by expansionist Russia and China's national communist regime and the continuing terrorist networks. And Wallace has a sobering prognosis. By 2030 at the latest, we will be in conflict. He himself was one of Ukraine's early and vigorous supporters, and he also persistently demanded more weapons and personnel for His Majesty's rundown armed forces. In the Sunday Time, Wallace also gives an insight into the private burdens that career politicians in leading positions are exposed to. For 7 years, during his time as Secretary of State for Security and Secretary of Defense, he slept by the bed with 3 phones. And the impairment of his private life is partly to blame for the failure of his marriage, which he very much regrets. Not least because of this, at least one of his children, who are now between 13 and 18 years old, advised him not to seek the office of Prime Minister last year. Judging by the popularity ratings among Conservatives, Wallace would have easily won the fight back then. But is he regretting this missed opportunity? Not at all. I want to finish this job and get back to normal, he says. But we all will miss Wallace. And I talked about this on my last live stream, and the people were commenting on this. And also, of course, like Wallace, like many other politicians, had connections to Russian finances in the past, let's put it like this. But it will be one of the few really competent people in this government leaving, even if he turned his stand on Brexit here. But we will miss him. I'm absolutely sure about this. Someone has really big shoes to fill soon. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.